Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
In the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus United States, Fred Korematsu challenged the forced internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Since the late 19th century, large numbers of Japanese and other Asian immigrants had come to America. Because of their willingness to work hard, often for little money, the Japanese found themselves targets of nativist hostility. This, combined with racial stereotypes, led to increasing fear and discrimination toward Japanese people living on the West Coast, regardless of whether they were Issei immigrants or Nisei Japanese American citizens, much like the family of Fred Korematsu, Japanese immigrants with American children. With the attack at Pearl Harbor, the long-growing fear of the Japanese reached a new level of intensity. Japanese Americans began to lose their jobs, and their loyalty to America was questioned. Families destroyed anything that could suggest their loyalty to the Japanese Empire, family photos, letters, and music, for fear of being taken into custody. Because of the supposed danger of Japanese Americans, General John DeWitt requested on February 14, 1942, permission to place all people of Japanese origin into camps until they could be further relocated. He told President Roosevelt, "The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken." In response, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, which created military areas. These were areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. Under this act, California and parts of Washington, Oregon, and Arizona were declared military areas because they were considered the most vulnerable to attack. On March 21st, President Roosevelt signed Public Law 503, which made the violation of a military commander's orders a federal crime. 6 days later, on March 27th, DeWitt, who was a military commander, ordered all people of Japanese descent not to leave the military areas without permission. If they did so, they faced federal arrest. Shortly thereafter, voluntary evacuation was put into effect. Any person or family of Japanese descent who wanted to leave the military area to avoid trouble from people who feared the Japs could obtain permission and move east. However, because the fear of invasion and sabotage was so great, evacuation was made mandatory. Posters went up throughout the military areas instructing all persons of Japanese ancestry to report to an assembly center, from which they would be sent to one of the 10 internment camps around the country. Evacuees were to bring only what was needed and only what could be carried by hand. Other items and even pets had to be left behind or sold. Most areas had little to no notice about the evacuation. The people in the area of San Leandro, California, where Korematsu lived, were given 5 days to abandon their lives and report for evacuation. Fred Korematsu did not comply with the government's wishes. He felt that the government was denying him his rights as an American citizen. He made plans to flee to Nevada outside the military areas, but was arrested on May 30th before he could leave. Korematsu was charged with breaking Public Law 503. He was put on trial on June 12, 1942, and found guilty. The judge sentenced him to a 5-year probationary period instead of putting him in prison. He was then taken to the Tanforan Assembly Center along California's coast. He was held there not as punishment for breaking Public Law 503, but simply because he was Japanese. Korematsu was then sent to the Topaz internment camp in Utah. He appealed his case from within the camp. While he was there, he was scorned by the other Japanese Americans. The majority of them felt that the best way to prove their loyalty was to cooperate with the government. Korematsu's resistance would not help them to get out of the camps, and they believed he should not have put up a fight. Korematsu's case finally reached the Supreme Court in 1944. The case was no longer about his violation of Public Law 503, but the constitutionality of the forced internment of Japanese Americans because of their race. On October 11th and 12th, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments from Korematsu's lawyers and the government's defense. The government argued that evacuation and internment were necessary to keep order on the West Coast, and that the power granted by the War Power Clause of the United States Constitution allowed special and extreme measures to be taken in times of war. They also used technicalities, such as that internment was not even relevant in Korematsu's case. His case was about Public Law 503. General DeWitt's final report was also included with the government's brief. Wayne Collins, who had been Korematsu's lawyer from the start, argued that Fred Korematsu should not have been treated differently because of his race, and that there should have been a test of his loyalty to America before he was sent to a camp. Last, he argued that Public Law 503 was an unconstitutional transfer of power to General DeWitt because Congress gave him little guidance on how to use that power. Two other attorneys, Charles Horsky and Morris Opler, filed amicus curiae, friend of the court briefs. Their argument was that Korematsu was justified in attacking the internment process. The government had forbidden Japanese Americans to leave the military areas after March 27, 1942, but also forbidden them to be there after the beginning of May. Korematsu was left with no choice but internment. After hearing the arguments, the Supreme Court deliberated for 2 months. Finally, on December 17, 1944, the Army announced its plan to close the camps. On the following day, December 18th, the Supreme Court announced its decision that the exclusion order was constitutional. 6 of the 9 justices voted against Korematsu. Justice Black gave the opinion of the court a limited approval of DeWitt's actions, stating, "We cannot, by availing ourselves of the calm perspective of hindsight, now say that at the time these actions were unjustified." However, Justice Murphy, one of the dissenting judges, wrote that the exclusion of people of Japanese ancestry because of supposed military necessity fell into the ugly abyss of racism. Fred Korematsu quietly returned to internment and moved on with his life. After being allowed to leave, he married and had 2 children with whom he avoided discussing the case. In 1983, Peter Irons, while researching a book, came across information concealed from the court by the War Department, assessing the danger of Japanese Americans. The danger was non-existent. Not a single Japanese American had been arrested and found guilty of espionage during the entire war. With this newfound evidence, Irons realized Korematsu could take his case back to court. Korematsu agreed, and a team of attorneys was found. A writ of error coram nobis, which suggests that there was a mistake in the earlier proceedings, was filed with the same federal district court in which his original trial was held. Korematsu used this new evidence to prove that the internment was not necessary and therefore an abuse of power and unconstitutional. Judge Marilyn Patel's ruling in Korematsu's favor did not reverse the Supreme Court decision because the case did not ever return to the Supreme Court, but his record was cleared and the Supreme Court decision was discredited. In 1998, Fred Korematsu was presented with the Medal of Freedom from President Bill Clinton.
In the long history of our country's constant search for justice, some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.
Throughout his life, Korematsu was seen as a hero for civil rights, especially because he was the everyday man with a job and a family who stood up for what was right. In 2004, in response to prisoners of Arab descent being held at Guantanamo Bay Prison without trial, he filed a friend of the court brief, reminding the court that the exclusion of a group of people based on race was all too familiar.